As we've been looking at this idea of city on a hill, and giving that metaphor as a visual for you individually, being that city on a hill, and us collectively being that city on a hill, God's people, that city on the hill with those nice walls and what those walls represent, the promises, the provision, and the power and the protection of God, and that temple within, and that's God. Its presence and worship and what that means to us and that whole metaphor. I just love it. I love, for those of you who are leaders, go back to Nehemiah again and again and look at those great leadership principles. Every time I read about Nehemiah, I think, oh, Lord, I want to be more and more like Nehemiah. And I also realize how little I am like him. And the older I get, the more I realize how much I want to be more like Nehemiah and employ those leadership principles in all the areas where God has given me the responsibility to lead. Okay? So it's been great. So that brings us up to chapter 10. And chapter 10, you remember at the end of chapter 9, the people were making a binding agreement. Well, at the beginning of chapter 10, they signed their names to it. And who's the first name at the top of the list? Nehemiah, the governor, the son of Hakaliah. What a great leader. Got his name in there, his big John Henry, if you will, on there so everybody can see I am committed. And so they made this agreement and they seal it. They seal it with their signatures. I got to tell you a story about a preacher friend of mine. I have weird friends. You know that, right? I just do. Some are real weird, Bruce, I didn't have to bring you up, but anyhow, But anyhow, I've got this one preacher friend, and he had a parrot. Now, this isn't Doc, okay? So don't think it's Doc. He's got a parrot, and it talks, but it's not Doc, so don't think it is. But his preacher friend had a parrot, and this parrot had a very foul mouth. He used to say a lot of bad words. And this guy would get very embarrassed when company's there, He's saying all these bad words. And so he kept trying to discipline this parrot not to say those terrible bad words. But the parrot didn't care. And he tried all kinds of discipline, but nothing seemed to work. And so one time he just got fed up and he put him in the freezer. And he heard a lot of commotion there, and then it got very, very quiet. He thought, oh no, maybe I've hurt this thing permanently. I better see what's going on. So he opens up the door, gets the parrot out, and the parrot says, look I'll never say another bad word again. Never, never, never again. I am totally 100% committed to always saying good stuff. And he's thinking, well, what overcame this bird? And the bird said simply, I have just one question. What did that chicken do? This guy's committed now, buddy. And that's what I want to talk about as we look at the house of our God. I want to look at commitment because that's what we're looking at here. We got these guys, they made an agreement with God. It's called a covenant. And this covenant agreement is not just spoken. They've written it down and they've signed their name to it. They are totally committed to it. And verses 28 through the end of the chapter, we got to read it. We got to read it. We got to look at the things that they're talking about, okay? Making this commitment. In verse 28, the rest of the people, and these are the people other than the ones who signed their name to it, so we're looking at everybody, okay? The priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand. All these now join their brothers and nobles and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God. Now they're going to go down and they're going to kind of bring it out, spell it out, what they're talking about. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us, or to take their daughters for our sons. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every 7th year, we will forego working the land and will cancel all debts. We assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give 1/3 of a shekel each year for the service of the house of our God, for the bread set out on the table, for the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, for the offerings of the Sabbaths, new moon festivals, and appointed feasts, for the holy offerings, for sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of our God. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, have cast lots to determine when each of our families is to bring to the house of our God a set times each year a contribution of wood to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. As it is written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle and of our herds and of the flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who are ministering there. Moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, and the first of our ground meal, our grain offerings, of the fruit of all of our trees, and of our new wine and oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contribution of grain, new wine, and oil to the storerooms where the articles for the sanctuary are to be kept, and where the ministering priests, the gatekeepers, and the singers stay. And the last verse right here, we will not neglect the house of our God. This is like a summary statement of all that was just said before. We will not neglect the house of our God. Now, I know for many of you, a list of those things that we just mentioned are probably foreign to you, unless you have done a good deal of studying in the Old Testament. As it talked about bringing tithes and offerings and first fruits, as it talked about the various jobs that people had, as it talked about bringing all this wood, in and all these different responsibilities, may be foreign to you. But just note this, that as they proclaim their faith and they proclaim their covenant relationship with God, that it wasn't just about God and what He brings to the table, but also my responsibility in living out this faith. This covenantal relationship that we have with God, it has something to do with me, that I'm a part of it. And that to neglect that is to neglect the house of God. And that bottom line on that was, we will not neglect the house of our God. I love that statement. These guys were committed, and we have come this far with this people that one time were just in a mess, weren't they? Their city was in a mess. Their life was in a mess. And from the beginning, we see what starts it all. We hear the Word of God. The Word of God brings conviction to them. The conviction brings them confessing. They're speaking now what it is that they're going to do. Right? And now, out of this conviction, out of this confession, they are now in covenant relationship, and they have a responsibility, and we will not neglect the house of our God. Great story of revival, great story of redemption, great story now where they're sealing it with commitment. Yeah, the C word, commitment. Why is it that today, more than any time in my very, very short young life, okay, it's going to be one of them days, huh? I see. All right. But it has seemed to have grown to be a bad word. Commitment. Young people and not so young people alike today, they don't like to commit to stuff. They like to leave that door kind of open. Got to keep our options wide open. This story here about these people, whatever you get from it and the responsibilities they have and your knowledge of how Judaism works in that time, know this. They were committed. They were committed to their God. They were committed to the things that their God required of them. They were committed. Commitment. Commitment's not such a bad word if you're jumping out of an airplane and you say, I'm committed to this parachute. Not such a bad word then, is it? I'm committed to it. I sure hope that parachute's committed to me. Don't you think? I mean, in some instances, commitment's really good. But sometimes we're not so hot on this commitment word. Why is that? Why are people hesitant today?